Okay, so I do have a goal of how far we can make it this morning, and I think it's an achievable goal, but we'll just plug along and see if I'm right. Sound good? With that, you've probably read this, and wow, it's not that the last section wasn't intense, but now we're really getting into some intense stuff going on in the book, huh? We are starting what I believe to be the third cycle of the book. I presented this. This is in your notes, the first note packet back in January. The third cycle goes from chapter 8, verse 2 through chapter 11. And I believe it's rather complicated to try and pick one major theme of a section, but I do believe that this section talks about how unbelievers, the non-Christians, do suffer. They may not always suffer in visible ways, but they do suffer. And you do have to remember, for all of what this book is, it's also a pastoral word to the church. For whatever and however we interpret these complicated symbols, one of the things that it has to still be is it has to be a word to the church of encouragement, of love, etc., etc. And you'll see one of the things as we get into some of these trumpet judgments, it's very easy to get egotistical, to get self-centered. That's something that all of us probably have and struggle with and have done. And it's very easy to think, I just suffer more than everybody else. I just have the worst luck. If it wasn't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. But that's not true. And the unbeliever and the ungodly do suffer in this world. With that, let's go ahead and start this third cycle, and we'll begin in Revelation chapter 8, starting in verse 2, and we'll go through verse 5. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, so that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar which is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense and the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hands. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. One of the things that I've definitely failed to do in the past as I've read through the book of the Revelation was to try and figure out where exactly John is. That is, where's his vantage point as he reports things. It's very easy to just keep focused on the scenes that he's seeing. But oftentimes, and you'll see it actually here in this very section, John has to change location in this section because now it seems he's in the heavenly, now it seems he's in the heavenly temple, but here shortly he's going to be back on planet Earth and he's going to see events on planet Earth. So the location here as we begin the third cycle is standing before God, standing before the altar in the heavenly temple, and these angels are given trumpets, and then there's this other angel who comes and incense is given to him that he might add it to the prayers of the saints. Now the last time that we saw incense and prayers together was chapter 5 verse 8, and there it seemed that the prayers of the saints and the incense were identical. The incense represented the prayers of the saints, whereas here there's this additional incense given to this angel that he might add it to the prayers of the saints. What could this be? Well, one idea would be that this incense given to the angels is the intercession of Christ. You'll remember Hebrews chapter 7, those who draw near to God, Christ lives to intercede for them. Could also be the intercession of the Holy Spirit. Romans chapter 8 verses 26 and 27 talks about when we don't know what we ought to pray for, the Spirit prays with us. So whatever this incense given to the to this angel, it could be the intercession, incense and intercession of Christ. It could be the intercession of the Holy Spirit. It could be both. There's no reason it couldn't be both, right? He fills the censer with fire from the altar and threw it to the earth, and there followed thunder and lightning and an earthquake. So this seems to indicate that there's judgment beginning with this action, lightning and thunder and earthquake. Now, the last time that we had an altar mentioned was back in chapter 6, verse 9, and the souls of the martyrs were under that altar. And there it wasn't clear which altar it might be. There's no hints as to which altar. It could be the altar of incense, or it could be the altar of the bronze altar, the altar of sacrifice. Whereas here, it does seem that this is obviously the altar of incense, with its connections in the text to the incense. And the angel's actions seem to, I skipped verse 4. These prayers of the saints and this additional incense, it rises up before God, and that's a good picture to have when you consider your prayers, when you consider the prayers of the church going up before God. And then this angel takes action. It seems to me that this angel would not act on his own accord. He would be acting according to God's will. So this appears to be God's response to the intercession and or to the incense and to the prayers. God's response with these trumpets, which will again end with final judgment, chapter 11, verse 18. And again, I'm of the opinion, I had the board up last time saying that I don't think that the book is in sequential order. I think that it overlaps oftentimes, the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments. And here, by the time we get to chapter 11, verse 18, I think we again see a glimpse of final judgment. With that, we're going to jump into the trumpet judgments and finish chapter 8. So starting in verse 6. And the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound them. The first sounded, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. And they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life in them died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Verse 10. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell upon a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of that star is called Wormwood. And a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. Verse 12. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun and a third of the moon and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened, and the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell upon the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpets of the 3 angels who are about to sound. Wow. A lot going on in just this short section of the book. I believe that the background for this section of Revelation, I believe that the primary background would be the Exodus. You've got to admit that the trumpet judgment sounds vaguely similar to the judgments on Egypt. Another possible connection would, of course, be Jericho. Here we have 7 trumpets of judgment that will eventually end in the destruction of a city. And you remember the trumpets and their part in marching around Jericho. Another thing is Ezekiel and Ezekiel's judgments on disobedient Israel. So again, the reason I think the Exodus is largely the background is because the similarity between the plagues here with the trumpet judgments and the plagues on Egypt. Jericho with its trumpet blasts and its judgments on the unrepentant. And Ezekiel chapter 4 and then chapter 5, Ezekiel must have been a very interesting character. I imagine that this was before the days of television, and so perhaps moms made sandwiches and sent them outside to watch the man who does interesting things all day long. At one point, he takes a sword and he shaves his hair, and he's to divide that hair into thirds. We saw a lot of thirds going on here in the text, didn't we? And the thirds are then dealt with, the thirds of his hair are then dealt with in different ways. And that's to symbolize God's judgment upon disobedient Israel. So I think that we again see quite a bit of Old Testament being used to communicate what's going on here. Obviously, one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest debates would be literal or figurative. And I've already shown my hand on how I interpret most things in the book of the Revelation, that these are symbols and that they're not meant to be an exact literalism. Going back to Revelation chapter 1 verse 1, I realize it's been a couple months since we've been there. You'll remember that chapter 1 verse 1, John specifically says that the angel communicated the revelation to him. And that word for communicate can be sign or symbolize, and it's the same word used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Daniel chapter 2 verse 45. There, Daniel, speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, says that the great God of heaven communicated, signed to you what would happen. And of course, that's the great statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreams about. So, was the statue literal? Well, it depends, of course, what do you mean by literal? If the literal means could we actually see the statue? Could we touch the statue? Could we smell the statue? I don't know why you'd smell a statue or taste the statue. Again, I don't know why you'd taste a statue. No, you couldn't actually see the statue because the statue was in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. But the head of gold was the Babylonian Empire. The chest and arms of silver was the Medo-Persian Empire. The waist and thighs of bronze was the Greek Empire. And then the iron legs and the iron and clay feet was the Roman Empire. So was it literal as in it spelled out what would literally happen? Yes. If literal means that, then yes. But again, the statue itself never existed. And I think the same is true when it comes to these things. We need to not see them as literal, but as symbols of how the ungodly are judged in this lifetime. One of the things that should stand out to us is this scene is quite violent. There is a lot of destruction and death going on in this section of the Revelation. And actually, the Revelation had to have its day in court back when the early church was trying to decide what books are from God and what books are not from God. There were a lot of critics in the early church of this book because it's so violent. And can you square such a violent book with a loving God? And of course, I agree with the church that agreed that yes, you can. Because we have to consider what God is accomplishing by these judgments. There is this idea, it's still very prevalent in our world today, and that is that we are still building utopia. That's our goal as humanity. That's where we're headed to. We're to build utopia, and we'll do this through enlightenment. Everybody will just become enlightened. And once everybody is enlightened, then we'll have the perfect civilization. One of the more recent decisions that they've ever reached is the problem for the last couple thousand years has been gendered pronouns. And if we would just everybody stop using gendered pronouns, we'd be one step closer to utopia. Does anybody follow that logic? Thank you. Because there's other things on their agenda as well, right? That's not the only thing on their agenda. A lot of people still view the world as a good place. Let me qualify this. The good creator, God, created a good creation. But that good creation fell into sin. And He, the good Creator God, still saw value within the creation, and He's working to redeem it. He's still working to redeem His creation. And that is a good work. But the world is a fallen place. The world is not a safe place. And anybody who holds this, the world is a good place, and evil, it's limited, and evil only happens occasionally. I wonder if they've not been paying attention for the last century, but not only for the last century, for the last couple centuries, evil is not limited. Evil doesn't just happen once in a while. Evil, depending on which news station you watch, evil happens every day at some place in the world. There is evil going on everywhere. And that's the thing about this. God is dealing with sin in these judgments. And sin is not just this little thing that's kind of darkened, ruined certain parts. I'm told that cheese is the only food that if a bit of it gets moldy, you can cut off that bit of the cheese and the rest of the cheese is fine to eat. If you know about mold in bread, you know if you find mold anywhere in the bread, you don't want to eat the rest of the bread because of the way mold spreads and how porous bread is. But evil, sin, has not just affected some small corner of the world. Sin has tried to ruin God's good creation, has it not? Has it not reached to terrible places? I want to highlight verse 13. And I want you to see that this eagle speaks of woe, woe, woe to those who dwell upon the earth. So these judgments are on the earth dwellers. And we talked about the earth dwellers in the last section as well. The trumpet judgments are against the earth dwellers. The servants of God have been marked back in chapter 4, and they're protected. We haven't got to chapter 9 yet, but you'll see that the next trumpet, those with the protection of God are actually protected against one of these judgments. And again, I speak to the symbolic nature of that marking, especially with our backdrops, our backgrounds here. The Exodus is a bit of is actually the primary background for this, but also Ezekiel, and you'll remember that in the Exodus, many times, and we'll get into which ones, many times the Israelites were protected from the plagues. The plagues were only on the Egyptians. And of course, with the final plague, with the symbol on your door, God's judgment would pass over you and would only affect those who don't have the symbol. The same true with Ezekiel chapter 9, where he has the vision of the fellow going through the city and marking on the foreheads those who don't like the way that Jerusalem has become a haunt for idolatry and so forth. We cannot ignore the connections that we see with these trumpet judgments and the plagues of Egypt. And so just to draw a couple quick parallels. The first trumpet has hail and fire and blood. That sounds a lot like plague number 7, the hail plague, and a little bit like plague number 1 with blood. Here with this first one, you'll notice that there's a lot of burning going on. A third of the earth is burned up, a third of the trees is burned up, and all of the green grass is burned up. Now the word there for green grass, when we hear the word green grass, we often think of something like our lawns, right? But the word here for grass is the word that can also be translated for hay or for animal grazing, for growing crops. That's the word. It's the same word used in Matthew chapter 13, verse 29, verse 26, and it's the same word used in Mark chapter 4, verse 28. There it's translated wheat. So it's not just everybody's lawn is burned up in this judgment. Produce, wheat, barley, those kind of things are burned up as well. Now I want to remind you of some of the horsemen. You'll remember the first horseman, Conquest. conquering. And you'll remember that in the ancient world, one of the best ways to conquer somebody is once your army is in there, start burning their crops. Remember that the Israelites were forbidden from doing this. You remember that, right, in the law of Moses. But scorched earth policy, that way whoever you're besieging, they run out of food. They run out of food for their cattle, etc., etc. The second horseman is war, and war is one of those areas that conquest comes in and does things like this. And remember, the third horseman, the black horseman, scarcity, famine. If we just scorched earth your place, your territory, your land, your crops are all burned up, what little remains, the price of that is going to go quite high. Sounds a lot like the four horsemen going on here, doesn't it? The second trumpet, the sea is turned into blood. That sounds pretty similar to the first plague on Egypt, where the Nile is turned into blood. But this burning mountain sounds a lot like God's judgment on Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 51. And Babylon and its commerce, its ships being destroyed. Sounds a lot like what's going on here, doesn't it? And you'll remember, if you were a Jew of the first century, and I brought up Babylon, what does Babylon represent? The land of captivity, the place of sorrow. The third trumpet, the waters become wormwood. That's, again, very similar to the first plague on Egypt, where the waters are turned into blood and nobody can drink the waters. This star that fell from heaven here with the third trumpet. Stars are often symbols of power. They're symbols of authority. And you'll remember in Jeremiah chapter 9, judgment is happening to Israel because Israel's leaders have defiled Israel. They've made life bitter for the Israelite. They've defiled their sources. So here we have defiled drinking water. Which again, if you're besieging a city and you've already burned up all their crops, what would be another great way to make the city you're besieging life miserable for them? To contaminate their water supply, The fourth trumpet, sun, moon, and stars are darkened. That's similar to plague number 9 in the Exodus, the darkness plague, which again speaks to why I don't think seal 6 has happened yet. But another thing I think we should see with this darkness and the fact that this happens in John writing. John's writing, darkness is often a symbol of spiritual blindness in a person's life. You'll remember this in John chapter 1, how those who live in darkness love the dark and don't want the light. So that could be going on here. We haven't gotten to the fifth trumpet yet. We'll get to the fifth trumpet in the next chapter. But you already know that the fifth judgment, or the fifth trumpet, releases these locust creatures, right? And of course the plague number 8 on Egypt, the locusts come. Now, God's plagues against Pharaoh were to show that God is in charge. You'll remember God says to Moses, Moses, your job is to go before Pharaoh, and your job is to say, Yahweh says, let my people go. And Pharaoh's response, at least at this moment, I'm not going to say it's a bad response. Pharaoh's question is, who is Yahweh that I should let his people go? Well, Yahweh's about to show up and show you who Yahweh is, and you should listen to him, by the way. Now, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and that leads to his own destruction, doesn't it? And we're going to talk more about that again later, because again, I believe that the Exodus and I believe that Pharaoh are great backgrounds for what's going on in this section. The trumpet judgments are God's plagues on those who won't repent. We'll see that in the next section as well. The earth dwellers, they harden their hearts and they don't repent. Sounds a lot like Pharaoh, doesn't it? Pharaoh hardening his heart and refusing to repent. Now, the seal judgments were on 1/4 of the earth, and the trumpet judgments are on 1/3 of the earth. There was once one of the fast food companies wanted to get an edge over the other fast food companies, and their product idea was that they would release a 3-pound cheeseburger to compete with most cheeseburger places have a 1/4 pound, right? But according to the marketing research, and you'll remember that these people pay market researchers big money in order to make money, enough of the American population thought that 1/3 was less than 1/4. And so they would think, why do I want to pay for 1/3 a pound when I can have 1/4 of a pound? Whether that's true or that's just one of those make you feel stupid stories, who's to say, right? But a third is greater than a fourth. Now, I don't believe that the text gives us any reason to think that Christians are somehow exempt from the seal judgments. And how I believe you look through world history and you see the 4 horsemen throughout world history, and I don't think that one event satisfies any of the horsemen. I think that world history just shows that. And you'll remember that I gave illustrations where Christians have suffered under war, under conquest, under famine, not because the Christian did anything wrong, but just because that's the nature of world war, and that's the nature and so forth. But the ungodly also suffered under those things, whereas here, these judgments are on the earth dwellers, and the ungodly do suffer consequences here on planet Earth. It's very easy to get in our minds that we're the only ones who ever suffer. We're the only ones who ever have it bad. But how many of you can look at somebody who's made sinful... Look at yourself. Look at anybody who's made sinful choices and see that they have suffered because of the outcome of their sinful choices. Does sin often lead directly to some sort of suffering? I mean, that's just the nature of sin, right? You might get away with it for a little while, but ultimately, you often face consequences here on planet Earth for sins. This eagle shows up here in verse 13 and cries out about Hotel California. No. No.
It says eagle, and my Bible says angel.
Yes. Yes. Do you have the King James there? New King James there. Yes. That is one.
California in there either.
Well, no. That was a play on the Eagles. But no. Yeah. There are a few manuscripts, the ones that were used by the King James and the New King James translators, that the word angel appears there in the text, where the majority of texts and the oldest texts have an eagle showing up. Eagles are often... Now, you'll remember that one of the 4 living creatures was an eagle, right? Is this that eagle? The text doesn't tell us. Eagles are often associated with coming destruction. You see this in the Old Testament. You see this in Deuteronomy. You see this in Jeremiah. You see this in Ezekiel. And in the Exodus, God says that He carried Israel on eagle's wings against the Egyptians. Now, is that literal when God says that? Did God literally turn Himself into an eagle and fly into Egypt and say to all the Israelites, get on my back, and flew them out? No, that's not literally what happened. That's symbolic of what God did for the Israelites as they are exiting Egypt. He carried them on eagle's wings. We'll begin chapter 9 then. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. Then the 5th eagle... It says angel, not eagle. Then the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given to them as the power of as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were told not to harm the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any of the trees, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not permitted to kill anybody, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And in those days men will seek death and not find it. They will long to die, and death will flee from them. The appearance of the locust was like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men, and they had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sounds of their wings was like the sounds of chariots and of many horses rushing to battle. They have tails like scorpions, and the sting, and in their tail is the power to hurt men for 5 months. They have as king over them the angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and his name in the Greek is Apollyon. The first woe has passed. Behold, two woes are still coming after these things. The fifth trumpet is also apparently the first woe. And John sees this star which had fallen. So this is past tense. He doesn't see this star fall. It's already fallen. Some people wonder if it's the same star as in verse 10, where the star wormwood falls upon the earth, but there's no textual connection there, so I'm not sure it is. This star is given the key to the abyss, which should make you ask, how can a star receive a key? Well, a star can't receive a key because a star is similar to our sun, or even greater than our sun, right? So this star has to be a symbol. It has to be a symbol of something. I want to draw your attention. I only noticed this on my every time as I prepare to read or as I prepare a class for a section, I read and I reread and I reread the section, and I then reread the book up to this point, and then I read past it, and then I keep reading, and certain things jump out to me that, how many times have I read this and yet they still jump out to me? Was given. That phrase happens in this book many, many times. You'll remember that the 4 horsemen, the white horseman was given a crown. The red horseman was given a sword. Here, this angel was given. I want you to notice all of the times that something is given to something, because I think that since it appears so many times in the text, it's probably an important thing to notice. But this star is given the key to the abyss. The star has to symbolize something, and I believe that the text behind this would be Isaiah chapter 14, 12a. Oh, how you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. There we have fallen, and there we have star together in the same passage. Now the context of Isaiah chapter 14 is a taunt against the king of Babylon. And I think that that has to be our primary read of Isaiah chapter 14. That this is a taunt against the king of Babylon. But it has long been interpreted, even before the Christian era, that this is a reference or a description to the fall of Satan. Has anybody ever noticed that there's no clear, here in the book of the Revelation, we'll see Satan thrown out of heaven. But other than that, there's no clear scene that describes how Satan fell from heaven, right? We have this passage in Isaiah that's often been interpreted that way, and we have one passage in Ezekiel that's often been interpreted that way. But those are kind of what lays behind the text, because the text has a primary meaning in its first read. The fact that Satan's description, Satan's fall, is not described in great details in the Bible, and in fact most people understand Dante and understand Paradise Lost and the Inferno and things like that to give us much more background on Satan and his fall. Well, my answer to that is this book isn't Satan's book. This book is God's book. And if God wanted to tell us everything, He could have told us everything. But God told us only the things that we need to know about it, you know. But again, this passage has, even before the Christian era, been associated with the fall of Satan. In certain Jewish apocalyptic texts, First Enoch, for example, fallen angels or spirits, they're often called stars. And you'll remember that First Enoch was a very popular read during the first century, including the letter of Jude actually quotes from Enoch. There we go. It is quite possible that this star which fell, described here in chapter 9, verse 1, is Satan. That's a possibility of who this star is. He opens the bottomless pit. Now, you have to see that God and Jesus are allowing this. Because you'll remember that it was Jesus who has the keys of death and Hades. Back in chapter 1. Now, Hades is another word for hell. It's another idea of the place of the dead. And here, this is able to open the bottomless pit. I think this speaks to me that God and Christ still have authority even over the abyss, even over the bottomless pit. It is where Satan dwells, but God and Jesus still have authority over that. Oftentimes in popular imaginations, Satan has been elevated to basically be God's equal and opposite. Is that the truth? No, that's not the truth at all. But within God's abilities, within God's parameters, and that's an important thing to see here, we see parameters going on here. God allows hell to be opened, in this case, at least to a certain degree. Hell let loose to some capacity. You'll notice that these locust things, they're told not to hurt any of the green trees or the green things. They're not allowed to harm the people who have the mark on their forehead, the people of God. You'll remember that in the Exodus plagues, the plagues of the flies and the cattle disease and the boils and the hail and the locust and the darkness, and with the blood of the Passover, Israel was exempt from all of those plagues on Egypt. This again speaks to me of even where God allows Satan, He allows Satan only a certain level, only a certain distance, only a certain amount of power. These locust creatures, they're not permitted to kill. Isn't that interesting? They're only given time to torment for 5 months. Now, interestingly, the locust's life cycle is 5 months. That's an interesting thing. It speaks more, though, than John was just a good agriculturalist of his days. It again speaks to me of God controlling boundaries and times. You'll remember, in the Exodus plagues, God set the times and the boundaries. And in fact, God would even tell, Moses, when you go before Pharaoh, even tell Pharaoh that tomorrow the plague will be over. And God will wait until that time to end the plague, showing that He is in control of these plagues. When the bottomless pit is open, the smoke and the darkening of the sun happens. God's judgment is often presented with smoke and with darkness. You'll see that again here when we get to chapter 12. And again, darkness is oftentimes a symbol of spiritual blindness in people's life. You see this in Luke, you see this in John. These locusts, remember that it was God who sent the plague of locusts on the Egyptians. And we get this very interesting description of these creatures. Is this not an interesting way to describe locusts? I mean, how many of you can picture a locust in your head? Does the locust look anything like the way John is describing the locust here? Now, the word like in the Greek, it's used here in verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, verse 10. I wanted us to see where else in Scripture the word like shows up. You'll remember in Matthew chapter 11, verse 16, Jesus speaking, "What shall I compare this generation to? They are like children sitting in a marketplace." And you'll remember that there Jesus is using this image of this generation is like children sitting in a marketplace. Was the generation literally children sitting in the marketplace? No, that's what the word like describes, right? Chapter 13, verse 31, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Luke chapter 6, verse 48, he who obeys my commandments and listens to them, he is like the one who builds the house on solid rock. So they use the word like the same way we use the word like. So these creatures, these locusts, they're described as like a scorpion. But they're also like a horse. And they have crowns that are like golden crowns. And they have faces that are like human faces. And they have hair that's like women's hair. They have teeth that's like a lion's teeth. They have breastplates that are like breastplates of iron, and so forth and so on. Okay, so I'm off hiking in the mountains here in Colorado, and I come back to you and I tell you I saw this creature. This creature reminded me of kind of like a sheep and kind of like a gazelle. What do you think maybe I saw? Maybe a mountain goat? You know, kind of like it, especially gazelle has the horns, and the mountain goat usually has those kind of horns. Okay, now I tell you I was hiking in the mountains and I saw something that was kind of like a turtle, that's kind of like a penguin, that's kind of like a kangaroo. What in the world did I see? That is the good question, and since I was in Colorado, that explains a lot, huh?
You found the funny berries.
I found those funny berries. Those are the berries you shouldn't eat, huh? Joel chapter 1, I believe, is the background for these creatures. Joel chapter 1 and then chapter 2, God describes the locusts as my great army. Joel chapter 2 describes the locusts as war horses and describes these locusts as men ready for battle. Really what's going on here, this is the stuff of nightmares, or the stuff of movie monsters, you know. Who here remembers back when creature features were the thing to watch, and there was this invincible creature that was terrorizing the people throughout the movie, and then you were scared to go to sleep that night because you were worried that the horrible creature would come and get you, right? Some have tried to take this literally, and they've tried to find something that could be this. Trying to find some sort of a war helicopter, or some sort of a future flying war machine, or a vehicle of some kind. And they propose that, you know, an ancient peasant Jewish fisherman trying to describe something like a war vehicle of the future. I'm of the opinion that since so much of the Revelation has Old Testament backgrounds, this is no exception. You'll notice that in Joel, those locusts in Joel are also described as having teeth like lions and sounding like chariots. My thought here is, again, there is a lot of word imagery going on here. Similar to Psalms chapter 99 verse 5 and then 132 verse 7. Worship at God's footstool. Does anybody happen to know where God's footstool is?
Somewhere in heaven.
Somewhere in heaven. Well, yes, the earth is described as God's footstool in Isaiah chapter 66:1. Now, if God's footstool was literally somewhere here on planet Earth, you would probably go to it, and then there would probably be these legs sticking up into the sky, right? Psalms chapter 17, verse 8 describes God's people as being protected under God's wings. How many of you walk around with something similar to a wing, something similar to an umbrella all day long protecting you? Isaiah chapter 49 verse 16, He has inscribed us on the palm of His hand. Well, if we take that literally, then first of all, God has to have a hand, a literal hand, and He also has to go to the tattoo place and get our name tattooed on the palm of His hand. By the way, I'm thinking that a tattoo on the palm of your hand has got to be one of the most painful places to get a tattoo, with all the nerves in your hand. Exodus chapter 32 verse 14, God changes His mind. This would suggest that, first of all, God literally has a mind that literally can change. What my thought is these are all what's called anthropomorphisms. Anthropomorphisms are trying to describe something in terms that we would understand, but not literally, not actually. There's no place here on planet Earth that there's this great pair of feet and these great legs sticking up into the sky. These creatures are an attempt at a physical description of things that are not physical. I think I advanced the slides. There we go. These creatures are a physical description of things that are not physical. Now, the text does not call these creatures demons, and the word demon is used later in the book. Now, some of the commentators have gone ahead and labeled these things as demons, and that is possible. But what I'm of the opinion of is that this is an attempt to put into words the horrors of hell that literally affect people here on planet Earth. Let's go back to what was opened. What was the key to? The bottomless pit. I want you all to picture planet Earth. If there was literally a bottomless pit, what would that mean? There's just a hole through the earth. That's not true. That's not really what's going on here. But when we allow the bottomless pit to be a representative of hell, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The place of wickedness, the place of evil, going down into the depths of darkness, going endlessly into eternal evil, into eternal darkness. And these are the things that come out. These are the torments of mankind. These are the things. And John is seeing this vision that is taking the horrors of hell and physicalizing them, giving them some sort of physical description. Now, you'll remember that in the ancient world, the locust was one of the worst creatures that could possibly come into your neighborhood, because the locusts were going to destroy all your crops. The locusts were going to ruin everything that you had worked so hard and you had planted and so forth. The scorpion. The place we would take kids in Mexico, they had scorpions. And so I looked up how to treat a scorpion sting. Do you know what I found very interesting about, of course, clean it and keep it clean and stuff like that. But actually, one of the things they recommend is Tylenol or ibuprofen or aspirin. And that'll just help with some of the pain that the person having the sting is going through. You've got to remember that this book is written long before aspirin or ibuprofen become an over-the-counter medicine. If you got stung by a scorpion in the ancient world, you're just going to have a bad day for the rest of the day and maybe into the night, So these symbols are just that. They're symbols of disaster, they're symbols of horror, they're symbols of struggle, they're symbols of all of the things that we physically deal with, and now hell is being given this kind of descriptive in people's life. I do not I do not want to make light. Hear me very clearly on this. I do not want to make light of suicide. But how many stories are there of rich, famous movie stars who made it to the top, rock stars, and other genres of music? Rock isn't the only one that has these, right? They made it to the top, but they lost the light. They fell. They could never get another number one hit. And they tragically took their own life. What happened there? Well, the horrors of hell are released on people. The horrors of hell get into people's heads the way a scorpion sting gets into a person's hand. And it torments them. And that's exactly what we see in the ungodly and in those who will not repent, the earth dwellers. With that, we do reach 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and take our break.